My neighbour has had pretty serious mental problems all the time I've known him, since he moved in about a decade ago. I was too young to really understand what was going on at the start, why he would pull up to his own house with a bumper caved in and stumble out of the car, why my mother would hide us away from the windows when he would begin storming around in the street, face red and eyes wide, shouting nonsense. Being a single mother and only child, we became an easy target for his rampages, and he would often hammer on our door trying to instigate a conflict. And I was a dumb kid, trying to protect our small house from a guy that I thought was just being an asshole. So once I answered the door to his rage. And I'll never forget how he was stood there, drenched in sweat with his eyes rolling in their sockets. His skin was red and straining and his jaw swung back and forward, gnashing his teeth. "Leave us alone, James. We don't have anything to say to you." But despite my choice of bold words, my 14-year-old voice cracked under his crazed gaze that reminded me of a racehorse. He might as well have stomped his feet into the ground. It was the first time, though it wouldn't be the last, that I'd looked into a man's eyes and seen that he wanted to kill me. Snarling like a dog, he had thrown his hands towards my face, and though I tried to dash backwards, he had grabbed at my hair. Tearing so hard, he was grasping a clump of my blonde locks in his closed fist not a moment later. I screamed and raised my elbows above my head, anticipating another blow. But it never came. Instead, there was a dull thump as James collapsed onto the ground, convulsing. It was almost a decade ago, but the sight of his sweat-soaked body writhing uncontrollably on the floor with his eyes in the back of his head and his own spittle flicking down his chin as he jerked was burned into my mind. Of what followed, I don't really remember much apart from his wife finally grasping the courage to rush out of her own home, mobile in hand, frantically weeping to the ambulance services. Honestly, it may sound cruel, but it wasn't the seizure that scarred me. It was his rage. Following the incident, and for many years to come, I had horrifically vivid nightmares of James being stood in the shadowy corner of my room, snarling and leering with my hair clutched in his fist as his eyes bored into my subconscious. The nightmares pushed me to seek professional help, and they suggested with pompous authority it may be due to my home environment. Being the only young daughter of a single mother, I was underexposed to a dominant male presence, especially a volatile one. That would be why it had shaken me so. I suggested that was bullshit and some gendered psychology jargon. I'd encountered men before, for Christ's sake. I didn't really bother with therapy much after that. I knew what it was that had shaken me. It was the way his eyes burned, pupils blown to the size of planets with such inhuman hatred. It was like having a genuine demonic entity at the door. The way his jaw swung, and flecks of blood from where he'd bitten through his own lips and cheeks were like something out of an exorcism film. I knew it was the effects of the overdose, and I would encounter many characters with similar facial features at 5 AM in sweaty clubs in London later on in life. Too many. But that day stuck with me, and I no longer answered the doors when he would later go on his rampages and begin shrieking in the streets. I feel I should explain that I live in a very middle-class area of rural England, where the general attitude to personal failings is to ignore it and pretend it wasn't happening. Prime example being James, who would relapse, begin his ritual raging, either the ambulance or the police would come and calm him down. We, the community, watch from behind our curtains and gossip in hushed tones about, "Oh, what a shame, what a waste of a young life." As I got older, James got fatter and more dull-eyed. I sometimes see him wandering around the village, seemingly lost and almost infantile. The medication they were giving him must have started working. Soon enough, though, I moved away for university, and the rages of my broken neighbour were no longer an issue I had to contend with. The 3 years passed hard and fast, with a lot of study, but also a lot else. I became harder, less trusting, and more wise to the realities of the world that we lived in. One morning I woke up covered in blood that wasn't mine, another with a tongue so swollen from where I had chewed through it I could barely breathe, and another with bruises on the inside of my thighs, and with my underwear around my ankles. Became life for a while. When I would visit home, James would sometimes be sat in his garden, which I could see from my old bedroom window. He'd be staring into nothing while absently petting his pet kitten, which apparently he had decided to get on a whim. I don't fear the man anymore. I pitied him. And I understood him. We were all running from something, and would do anything to allow us to forget. At least that's what I thought. About a year after graduating, due to some unforeseen circumstances, I had to move back in with my mum. Long story short, my boyfriend of 4 years had found someone younger and less complicated and promptly kicked me out of our shared flat. And I don't want to go into it, to be honest, but let's say it certainly didn't make things any less complicated for me for a long while. And I wasn't fond of the village I had grown up in, especially after living in my dream home of London for so long. I spent a lot of time alone at the house, as my mum works abroad almost constantly. And it was a big fucking house just to have one person in it. As a kid, it used to scare me, but as a battle-scarred veteran, I felt like now I was fine. I usually just come home after work, drink myself into a stupor and pass out, rinse and repeat. Pathetic, I know, but I was going through some shit, alright? It was about a month after moving back into Miles' place that I saw James for the first time again. I was driving home, bottles clanking in the backseat and half my attention on the rear view mirror, staring at my own blotchy face. God, I look like shit. Why don't I just fucking... James was stood in the middle of the road, slack-jawed and staring straight at me. I slammed on the brakes and my tyres skidded, coming to a stop less than a foot from where his protruding belly hung below his stained shirt. As I steadied my breathing with one hand on my chest, I held his empty gaze. As something clenched uncomfortably in my gut. His posture was completely limp, with his hands almost swinging by his sides, and his neck barely supporting his head. It was like some invisible force was holding him up by the scruff of his neck. A human ragdoll. I'd almost hit him at 50 miles per hour and he hadn't even flinched. Unsteadily, I opened my car door, not taking my eyes off James. His eyes didn't follow my movements, but instead continued to stare emptily at the driver's seat. James? I called out. My voice didn't quaver like it had as a child, but I still didn't sound brave. He didn't respond. I checked about quickly for any other cars, but with this being rural England, there wasn't a sodding soul. It was only then that I noticed that the air had a strange smell to it, like how it smells when lightning is about to strike. But it was a bright spring day, and the sky was completely devoid of cloud. James? You right, mate? I approached slowly with my arm extended. I couldn't get the idea of something holding him up out of my head, and I felt I could almost see the strings pulling on his shoulder blades. His whole face was bloated and lumpy from the years of alcoholism, the slackness of it all casting deep, hollow shadows under his eyes, which had shrunk to pinpricks. I stopped in my tracks about a metre distance from him. Something was wrong. I could feel it in the way the smell of electricity was making my hair stand on end, and the twisting of my gut was pulling me back into my car. As I withdrew my arm, James seemed to almost vibrate. Tiny movements shivered through his lifeless body, and the smell became stronger than ever. Fuck this. I stumbled backwards with my hands blindly reaching for my car door. My fingers painfully crashed against the car frame, and I tried to swing myself into the driver's seat, knocking my head slightly as I went. Falling in behind the wheel, the air seemed to explode with a crack, and I screeched, curling myself into a ball, convinced lightning had struck the car. I couldn't have looked away for more than a second. James was stood on the other side of the road opposite my car, facing into the darkening fields, approximately 15 feet from where he'd been stood less than a moment ago. I turned on the ignition, slammed my foot on the acceleration, and my tyres screeched as me and my car fled the scene. When I arrived home less than a couple of minutes later, it must have taken me less than 10 seconds to leap from my car, bottles and keys in hand, and slam my front door shut behind me. The sun began to set rapidly as I double-locked all the entrances, checked all the windows, and drew the curtains before pouring myself a large drink and stationing myself in my mother's room, where I could peek down into the street below. Almost invisible. I knew what I had seen. I had either lost time when that crack had split the air, or when I smacked my head, or James wasn't himself. Whatever that even was. I needed to keep guard. But that night I fell asleep with my bottle in my lap, and I didn't see James again. In fact, I didn't see him for another 2 weeks. This time I'd been home for about an hour, so already had a few drinks, but nothing that could distract me from the sudden familiar feeling of static and the smell of electricity that infested the air. I rushed to my mother's empty bedroom and with curtains drawn, peered down into the street below. My movements were a little sloppy and my mind already a little distractible. Looking down into the inky street of which I had grown up on, I couldn't help the bittersweet childhood memories coming back. I felt my brows knit together on my forehead in a furrow as my fingers clenched around my glass. I'd been so damn innocent back then. So damn naive. I took another long drink and reached again for the bottle. That's when another loud crack caused me to start in my seat and curse as I spilt half of it down myself. Peeking through the blinds, I saw his wonky figure dimly silhouetted in the dying light. He seemed to stand motionless for a moment, before almost tumbling forward in staggering, lopsided steps. He was only just managing to stay upright, as if trying to master his limbs like a paraplegic in rehabilitation. This wasn't the drunken stagger I was familiar observing, but rather something truly and disturbingly unnatural. Through my tipsy state, a sharp needle of true fear slid down my spine as he drew closer, in his awful, exaggerated, disjointed stride. It was as if it was something trying to mimic a man's stride. From this distance I could see that his gaping mouth was opening and closing as his neck bucked as if he was choking on something. His head rolled on his neck, throwing him off balance slightly, and he stumbled into a lamppost which illuminated his features in lurid display. My alcohol-soaked stomach flipped as I saw his mouth and teeth were soaked in his own blood, from where he was grinding, trying to spit out his own words past a bloated tongue. His eyes were rolled into the back of his head, exposing the ghoulish bloodshot whites. His skin looked so pale and grey under the light. For a moment I imagined it were running like wax off of his skull. It was as I was staring in horror at this mockery of the human state that his eyes sunk back down from out of his head and met mine directly. My breath caught in my throat, and as I held his gaze I found myself unable to breathe. His chapped white lips were trying to curl upwards in what I could only guess was a hellish attempt at a smile. He has too many teeth. How does he have that many square teeth? These thoughts floated across my mind, but they barely registered. Unable to move, I found myself only able to stare with my own eyes pinned open as his arm jerked up towards me, extending his fingers almost in a beckoning fashion. It was in this moment that I saw his hand had no thumb, no scar, no blood, just smooth white skin. It was as if his body had glitched and forgotten to include them. My stomach heaved and it broke the trance. I scrambled desperately to my feet and fled to the bathroom to throw up my guts. While sobbing and sweating on the bathroom floor, I called the police, begging them to come as fast as they could, that my neighbour was threatening me while intoxicated and I was home alone. In the 15 minutes it took the officers to get to my house, I remained in the bathroom, mobile phone clutched to my chest and armed with nothing but the bottle I was trying to drink as quickly as possible in case I needed to smash it to use as an improvised weapon. As I cowered on the floor between the sink and the tub, I thought I could hear a faint, chattering, gibbering sound circling the house, drifting in from the left, coming closer before disappearing to the right again, before returning. Hot tears spilled down my face. By the time the police arrived, I was in full-blown hysterics, and they told me with steely voices that they had found no one, and no evidence of anyone around the building, and that they had spoken to my neighbour and he had been preparing and eating dinner with his wife for the past hour. I tried to explain what I saw with slurring words, but I was promptly cut off sternly by the female officer. After a quick chat about public intoxication and false police calls, they drove off with their sirens silent, and I was left alone in the place, and in a body I wasn't sure I felt safe in anymore. I crunched up some sleeping pills and receded into the safety of the abyss, desperate for it to embrace me so I could block out the occasional chatter I thought I heard from my window. That was just over a week ago, and I keep seeing him everywhere now. At work, we've been receiving these calls where it's just static and that goddamn gibbering sound. Out in public, I swear I keep smelling the awful stench of ozone which has me fleeing from the area. And worst of all is that when I'm driving home, I keep thinking I see him, stood on the side of the road, only for him to vanish again when I look. My drinking has become out of control, and I've started taking a hip flask to work just to keep down the panic attacks. I feel strung out. The circles under my eyes look like bruises, and I haven't been able to eat anything in days. My desk keeps getting covered in little blonde hairs from where I've nervously tugged mine out. My colleagues have asked me, tentatively, if everything is alright. But I just give them the shaky response, everything is fine. It's fine. Everything's fine. I have this dim sense of unravelling, is the only way I can describe it. And I don't know if it's James, or this village, or me, or something else entirely. But whatever it is, it's accelerating. It feels like it's starting to open at the seams. Tonight, I'm sat on my own windowsill, chain smoking a pack of Reds and gulping down hard vodka as much as I can bear. From where I am sat, I can see him, clear as day. He stood in my mother's back garden, clearly illuminated by the automatic lights we have out there. James has stood at odd angles, with his joints hanging the wrong way and his body vibrating minutely. He's leering, with a bloody smile that is far too large for his face. The harshness of the light only makes his gory, gnashing teeth stand out all the more against his greyness. His eyes, they're the worst though. They're almost cartoonish in their abnormal size, set deep into his face but wide enough and rolling to show the thousands of burst vessels at the same time as the absolute onyx of the blown pupil which has completely swallowed the iris. They stare up at me, and I stare back, with ice coursing through my veins and my body shaking uncontrollably with adrenaline and pure fear. I can see this all, and yet I must continue to look and keep him in my sight. If I keep my eyes on him, at least I know where he is. Tears stream constantly down my face, but my sobs are silent. The only noise is a small tinkling of my glass rattling against my rings as I tremble. That, and the small chittering noise that comes from down below. That is the reason that I have to stay up here on guard. Because though this awful thing in the shape of James has me terrified for my life, I am more afraid of what stands behind him. Caught half in the shadow caused by James' shuddering body, there is another figure. It stands awkwardly and crooked like him, as if its limbs have been broken and healed wrong. It vibrates against the air like him, and its neck twitches every half a minute or so to emit a small, high, unnatural chittering. I can't see any features as it's facing away from my vantage point, but I can imagine they are also blown out of proportion and hellish. I drain my glass, and without looking away from the creatures in the garden, I swiftly pour myself another blind, but spilling nothing. I light another cigarette and feel the smoke hard on my lungs, and the hard liquor tingle down my throat, lining my insides like lead. I may not be able to see the face of the other figure, but its platinum blonde hair certainly looked a lot like mine.